Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to wherever you're watching or listening from. My name is Jamie Robinson, and welcome to episode 268 of the Wakefield Trinity Heritage Podcast. Time for exactly that, time for some heritage today as we dive into the past once again with our brand new segment, the Heritage Hour. This time, we are covering the 1896-97 season. For anybody that didn't listen or watch first time round, we're trying to take a bit more of a deep dive and connect more with our heritage side of the podcast and Dad's historian research for Wakefield Trinity. So link back into the first video or the first podcast where we touched on the first ever season of Wakefield Trinity, 1895-1896, because when we bring in these Heritage Hour podcasts, they are going to be following on podcast by podcast. So you might want to build them up and listen to them all in one, or follow them through and get a bit of a story as well. So they're going to be quite good, and they're going to give us something extra to do through the years to come. So before we start, I can't do it on my own as always. Let me introduce my co-host, my dad, Lee Robinson. How are we doing, Dad?
Hello and welcome to our second Heritage Hour of the season. I wonder how far we'll get. We're 130 years ago, so I wonder if we'll get 130 months ahead of us and get up to modern day. But as Jamie said, as this is principally a heritage podcast, we thought we would dive back into the archives and start looking at seasons of yesteryear. And this month we continue in the 1890s, 130 years ago, back in 1896, 1897.
Yeah, so like I said, for anybody that's wondering what happened in the previous year, we're not going to dive in too much because we'll leave that to the previous podcast. But Dad, yeah, a fairly average start to the Wakefield Trinity campaign. What paint a picture for us for how the second season started and what was the changes from the first league structure for 1896, 1897?
Yeah, bit by bit, the Northern Union, as in what we call rugby league now, wanted to move away from rugby union, the rules and everything else to go with it. Generally, the Northern Union hierarchy were very happy with the first season of professionalism, and by August 1896, they now had 59 teams in membership, with further applications coming from many areas. So a lot of the Yorkshire and the Lancashire teams were now drifting away from rugby union and wanted to play Northern Union. The Northern Union had to pick and choose who to put in. They couldn't put all 59 teams in a league. So they started admitting eight new clubs and thus decided on a new league format. In the previous season, which we've talked about, there were 21 clubs played, and they also played each other home and away with 42 fixtures. But it became a bit of a struggle financially and logistically with travel across the Pennines, as an example. Not too bad now because we play Wigan and Widnes and St Helens exactly away, and it's a couple of hours in a car. Back 130 years ago, it was a bit of a drag on trains, and it cost a lot of money, and there are all sorts else going on. So I decided to split the leagues up. There was 14 clubs from Lancashire and 16 from Yorkshire, so they had separate leagues and had a Lancashire senior competition and a Yorkshire senior competition. And Bramley, Castleford, Heckman Wyke, Holbeck, and Leeds Parish Church were all new teams that were admitted into the Yorkshire League. Morecambe, Swinton, and Salford were new in Lancashire. But interestingly, Holbeck played at Elland Road, the actual same pitch where Leeds United play now. So Trinity joined the New Yorkshire League, playing 30 games, 15 home, 15 away. And there were lots of other teams as well. So they had a second team, a second tier, a bit like a reserve grade we have now. So other teams that did not make that senior competition were formed into second competitions in those counties. Teams like Dewsbury and Hull Kingston Rovers went into those senior competitions, second competitions before they got promoted in years to come.
And it's worth saying, isn't it? Like you're saying, this is still 1896, 1897. Getting across to Lancashire or the Pennines would have been an absolute mission, really. It would have been the same as getting to Toulouse or France now, because to paint a picture, the M62 wasn't created until 80 years later in the early 1970s. So I'm sure there were particular roads or something you could actually get to Lancashire, but I'm assuming, Dad, it would have been far, far, far more difficult than it is now.
Well, yes and no, because the train structure was far better than it is now. There were obviously no cars then. So even though there might have been roads, I don't know. I don't think it went by wheels. So I think if you were going anywhere in the country, it was all by trains. And I do believe 130 years ago, the rail network wasn't too bad. There was a lot of trains, a lot of regular trains. So if we were playing Wigan, St Helens, any of these Lancashire teams, Oldham away, we all went on trains. And so did the fans. The fans went on trains as well. When they got off the trains, then they maybe had to walk to the grounds. and the teams had called them charabancs, or there were horse-drawn buses, horse-drawn carts that took the players from the stations to the grounds. But yes, it was difficult just to sort of. It was just all trains to get across the Pennines. Even worse if I'm not sure Workington and Whitehaven were long. Then it come into the 1940s. But any Cumbrian teams or up on the west coast was a devil to get to. Similar to Hull and Hull Kingston Rovers. It was 60 years, 60 miles the other way as well. So yes, happy days.
And yeah, just a quick Google search tells me that cars didn't actually come to the UK until 2 years before this. So 1894 was when the first cars and automobiles started being in the UK, and I'm guessing it would have been a long time before they became a staple in for every person, every household. So I reckon you had to be the royal family or someone who was mega rich to even own a car.
Yeah, it's probably like owning a private jet now. Nobody had them unless you had a fair bit of money.
Do you, just a personal point, do you know much about our family around this time? Did we have family members living around Wakefield in 1896, 97?
Yeah, the Robinsons were all farmers, and we there weren't so much living in Wakefield. We actually came from a place up near York, and they gradually came down to the coal mines in Wakefield. My granddad was born in 1913, so it's still another 15, 16 years until my granddad was born. So his dad was born in a place called there's a place called anybody that's living miles away won't know it, but a place called Oselwell Green. It's a little village between Wakefield and Rothwell, in between Stanley and Rothwell. So that's where a lot of our family came from. All live in terrace houses, either worked down the pit or worked as farmers. So that's where the Robinsons all came from.
So when did, working class families like us, when did they first get cars? When would your granddad have got a car? Did he ever own one?
Yes, I think my dad first got a car in the early 1970s. My granddad drove, well, he worked at the pit, so he actually drove a pit van or a first aid van in the 60s. And I'm sure he had something called not a mini, but something called a Wolsey Hornet or a Wolsey something back in the 60s, or a little minivan. So yeah, my granddad started driving. I don't think he had a license because I don't think he needed a license, but he first sort of had wheels in the late 60s, and my dad first got a car in the early 70s.
Yeah. I'm always just trying to paint a picture for us and for the listeners, just for how comically rare, like you say, it would have been like owning a private jet or a spaceship at this point, wouldn't it, to have a car? So to get to anywhere, you would have had to rely on public transport, trains, buses, and bikes. I guess bikes were bikes a bit. I know you wouldn't have cycled over to a Pennine region for a rugby game, but did people own bikes then?
They must have done because you had penny farthings back in the day. So I think you did have bikes, and that's how you maybe went to work on the bikes. But I remember my granddad telling me, and my granddad's been gone for 40 years now. But whenever they went to Trinity, they started going to Trinity in the 1940s when my dad was little. You'd get buses. So sometimes my dad said he'd actually walk from Stanley into Wakefield, or the other way around. I think he'd maybe get a bus from Stanley to Wakefield, then walk from Wakefield to Bellevue. As he got fitter, he'd walk all the way from Stanley to Bellevue. But I think that's what my grandma and granddad did: catch buses to Trinity and walk as far as they could do. So, yeah, long before cars and car parks down Doncaster Road.
Yeah, brilliant. So like you said, it was separated into two leagues at this point: the Yorkshire Senior Competition and the Lancashire Senior Competition. We'll briefly talk about the Lancashire one because obviously we won't be talking about that really here. 14 teams in that. Broughton Rangers won the league. Then they were obviously quite a dominant team back in the day. And then the league table after that was Oldham, Tildesley, Runcorn, Stockport, Swinton, Warrington, Leeds, Saints, Widnes, Wigan, who are obviously big teams now, Rochdale, Salford, and then Morecambe finishing bottom. And then there were 14 teams in that Lancashire League, and then the Yorkshire League, there were 16 teams. But just reading them out now, Dad, out of these 16 teams, 10 of those teams came from either a Leeds or Wakefield postcode. So it shows how dominant this region was in building rugby league in Yorkshire at the time. Because we'll talk about the league table later on. But just from a Wakefield postcode, you've got Batley, Wakefield, Castleford, Liversedge, and Heckman-Wyke. And then Leeds, from a Leeds postcode, you've got Hunslet, Leeds themselves, Leeds Parish Church, Bramley, Holbeck as well. So, and then you've got teams like Halifax, Brighouse. Brighouse obviously ain't too far. Manningham, Hull, Bradford, and Huddersfield padding out the rest of the league. So again, very, very Leeds and Wakefield heavy at this point.
It was, wasn't it? Sort of very West Riding orientated, wasn't it? So it must have been an eternity playing Hull. Hull were the furthest away and 30 miles, 40, probably more, for 30, 40, 50 miles from the further than anybody because all Kingston Rovers weren't going. York weren't in it. You had no South Yorkshire teams like Doncaster in it. So yes, it was very sort of West Riding orientated with Hull stuck on the east side. And it's interesting looking at that. There's 16 teams in that league. Seven don't exist anymore. On the Lancashire side, there's 14 teams. There's only four or five that don't exist. You know, your Oldhams, your Swintons, Warringtons, Leeds, St Helens, Widnes, Wigan, Rochdale, Salford. They're all still going. So there's only two or three or four out of the East Lancashire: Broughton, Tilsley, Runcorn, Stockport, Morecambe, who've gone.
And you mentioned as well, obviously, that the game was pretty happy with where they were in their second official season. But it surprised me that there was still a lot of rugby union stuff in there as well. You mentioned they're trying to slowly wean this stuff out, but stuff like lineouts was still a thing in that first season, and rule changes were being pushed on it now.
Yeah, you can do a timeline of how the rules changed bit by bit. The actual players and the clubs wanted to change the rules quite quickly, but the Northern Union Committee kept blocking it and said, "Oh no, we're all right for now. We'll do it bit by bit." So that, but they did want to gradually change. You know, the big one was still playing with 15 players, and that didn't change for a year or two. In this season, the lineouts disappeared, and they replaced it with a kick. So when the ball went out over the side of the field, we have a scrum now. Back in 1896, they just kicked it back in. So it was whoever, I think if whoever kicked it out, the other bloke kicked it back in again. The score would remain the same as well, but that would change as the season went on. Three tries, 3 points for a try, two for a conversion, four for a penalty, and three for a penalty, and four for a drop goal. So four drop goals were just quite lucrative, getting 4 points for those. They also had rucks and mauls, so basically there wasn't a play the ball either. So it was exactly the same as rugby union. So whenever you got tackled, everybody piled in, rucks and mauls. But the rule came in and it said if a player holding the ball is tackled and the ball is firmly held, he will have to put it down on the floor in front of him. And that's the start of the play of the ball. So that was all on the field stuff. Off the field, transfers were tightened up because back in the day, you could just leave a club and go somewhere else without telling anybody. So you'd get picked for an example, you get picked for Wakefield. And then if you didn't want to play for Wakefield, you'd go sign for Leeds. And Leeds would pick you and Wakefield would be wondering where you were. So a law was brought out that basically before any transfers happened, it had to be agreed by both teams, and that's where the contracts came in. So you couldn't just leave and go and not tell anybody else. You know, there's also an interesting law as well. Maybe it came through from the rugby union days that players had to be in employment to play the game and be registered by the Northern Union. So it apparently stopped laziness. So you had to have a job before you were signed on by anybody, and clubs got fined if they played unemployed players. So sometimes clubs just put them on and made them give them a brush and said, "Oh, you're the cleaner in the grandstand for today." But yes, that was a law that was highlighted and sort of quite firm that you had to have a job before you played at the weekend.
Um, so we're looking at obviously the league. League was obviously a big important thing from that point of view. But then you're looking at obviously something that's still big now, and there's conversations around it now and its importance in the game. But the Challenge Cup was in its early days as well. We mentioned in the first podcast in Heritage Hour the Challenge Cup wasn't a thing; it was primarily the league. But to bring it into the forefront was around about this time.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just counting there because yes, the Challenge Cup it was brought out to maintain because obviously you've got your Yorkshire teams and your Lancashire teams, the inter-county games. The one that they devised this Northern Union Challenge Cup where it was an open draw, where then you could start playing teams from across the into Lancashire again. And it was all in. I was just trying to quickly count up how many teams were admitted. Obviously, we've got 30 league teams because of the Lancashire and Yorkshire teams, but there's 44, 45. There's over 50 teams in the Challenge Cup. So, and what they basically did, it was played at the end of the season. So when the league was done, basically all member clubs were invited with all senior clubs and all junior clubs going into an open draw. Each round was then drawn in advance. So they were once the league season done and finished, that's when the Challenge Cup started. But the draw was made months earlier. So Trinity knew months earlier um, that then we're playing Lee in the first round. So yes, there's 52 teams admitted, but they had to have a lot in there. There wasn't, it didn't tally up with the first round, second round draw. So there were a few who had buys. Trinity knew months earlier that they'd drawn Lee away in the first round of the cup. So then the next draw would made as well. So they knew if they could beat Lee, then they were going to play Brighouse Rangers away in the next round because they had a bye. And then on top of that, they also knew if they got through Brighouse, they would be playing Batley, Bramley, or Morecambe. So everybody knew you knew who you were going to play in the final long before um, the games were played. So whether that's good or bad, I don't know. And I've got all the first round draws in front of me. I meant to pass you this on. You've got teams like Eastmore in it, Stockport Rangers, Latchford Rangers from Warrington. There's a few more I'll pick out when we go into the cup later on. But Eastmore drew Oldham Juniors in the first round, and Trinity drew Lee. So that was the sort of plan. So a lot of people didn't like knockout cups. The hierarchy. There were some good reasons why they didn't want it. We'll probably go into that on the next month when the sort of Challenge Cups got going. But even though it was quite good for inter-county rivalry, there was a few hierarchy didn't like knockout cups for various reasons.
Just in terms of the logistics of the Challenge Cup, even coming to the modern day, where do you prefer it? Because obviously, even when I was growing up, the Challenge Cup would almost be predominantly at the first half of the year, and sometimes, am I true in saying that the final was sometimes even before the league started? Or because I know the initial Super League season, they'd done, I think they'd played up until the semi-finals already and then the final would be only a couple of weeks into the season. Obviously, the early days here, the Challenge Cup is at the end of the season, and now obviously it's mixed in. Sometimes it's in the bank holiday Sunday, sometimes now it's in May time. Where do you prefer the Challenge Cup sitting? Let's assume that it's going to continue.
I think it works as it is now. It was difficult when you had your Challenge Cup Bank Holiday August, or the final at Wembley in August, because there was too much going on at that time of year. With the grand final a month afterwards. Again, when Super League started, you had your first, second, and third rounds all at the beginning of the season before the league campaign started. Then you throw in the semi-finals and the final. The final was always round about Bank Holiday May time. So the fact that they've got it sorted now, they had a first round before the season started. They've had the second, all the junior rounds before the season started. Wakefield came into it in round three before the league season started. Then we had a break for when we played Leeds in the fourth round. Then we've got Easter. Then we've got a break when we play Wigan in the quarterfinals. Then there's another couple of league games before the semi-finals, and then the final at the end of May. So I think at the moment it worked quite well. The arguments at the moment are where do you play the final, isn't it? I'm an old traditionalist. I'm determined to see Wakefield play at Wembley before I pop my clogs, whether it's this season or another season. So if they start taking it away from Wembley, I think the buzz has gone. But I'm 60-year-old now, so I'm an old dinosaur in respect to that. I was brought up in the 70s when the Challenge Cup final was a massive day out. I was so excited every Friday night before we went to Wembley. And so was everybody else. You had buses, you had coaches, you had buses and coaches going from every club in the town. You had people going on trains, and you filled Wembley out wherever. So when Wakefield went in '79, the city virtually closed when we went down. So yes, it's just that and it's faded away until you just don't get that anymore. It is expensive to get to London. It is expensive to get your tickets if you're all going. So there's pros and cons with the Challenge Cup. But yeah, somebody asked me last year if you got a choice between Trinity winning the grand final and Trinity getting to Wembley and winning the Challenge Cup, what would you pick? And I picked the Challenge Cup because I'm an old traditionalist, and it's been part and parcel of my rugby league upbringing for the last 50 years.
And this is the first official Challenge Cup, 1896, 1897. We'll talk about it already from a Wakefield perspective because we didn't last long, did we? Really. So, like you say, we drew Lee in that first round, and a 0-0 draw. Again, this is quite commonplace. Is the scoreline of a nil, but a 0-0 was still slightly rare, even though it was slightly more common. That was away at Lee, and then we drew him at home again 4 days later in the replay and beat him 13-4. And then we played Brighouse in the second round. And again, I'm not going to say it sounds easy, but it's easy to forget Brighouse are actually a good team at this point. And you've touched on already, Brighouse actually won the league this year, so they won the Yorkshire League. So it's like getting Wigan in the second round, isn't it, a little bit? And you think, oh, blooming heck. Actually, I'm just looking there. It says Brighouse Rovers. Is that a different team?
Hang on a minute, have I got that wrong? I'm sure it's Brighouse. Brighouse Rangers.
Oh, right, okay,
That's
yeah.
how we
So,
played. Have I put
oh,
Rovers on there?
I was just thinking there's not two different teams. So yeah, we drew Brighouse Rangers in the second round, away and lost 11-4. So we were out the Challenge Cup in by the second round already.
Yeah, that's right. And like you just said, it was like drawing Wigan away in the second round because they were the champion team. But I've got all the scores in front of me now, and it's just we played that 0-0. It was quite good. The weather was awful back in the day. I was going to mention it back later on, but you still got the muddy weather, and it kept the scores low. There wasn't much free flowing rugby. And there was a lot of scores when we hardly ever scored. Looking at some of the first round, the Challenge Cup scores, you got 7-0s. You got Broughton Rangers and Warrington drew 0-0 in the first half. Hull beat a team called Walkden 9-0. You got Wigan 3, Radcliffe 0 in the first round. So you still got these not silly, but low scores. In the second round, Eastmoor 3, Stockport 3. Um, Tilsley 9, Leeds 3, Wigan 7, Manningham 0. So it flows. There's a lot of low scores. But then you got some silly blowout scores. This must be the Challenge Cup we have now. It was surprising because scores were pretty hard to come by. But yeah, in the first round, you had Rochdale Hornets 63, Waterhead Hornets 3, Runcorn 65, Warrington Locos 0, St Helens 58, Leeds I think from Oldham 0, Widnes 55, Atherton Hornets 0. So you still got your big blowout scores as well, as long as as well as your 0-0s and your 3-0s.
A lot of church teams as well, weren't there? There was a what was that? Swinton Church lost to Bradford by 60 points, and obviously Wakefield Trinity. Bradford Church Hill lost to Crompton, and yeah, so a lot of church teams. But yeah, fast forwarding. Obviously, we just talked about Wembley. The game wasn't at Wembley for a long period of time. It was the final here was at Headingley. Between Batley and St Helens, and Batley won 10-3, 13,500 there. Um, there's actually a couple of pictures knocking around online as well, which is brilliant. Some great stuff there. But yeah, you always see it, don't you? Batley, obviously the first ever Challenge Cup winners, and the names are always in lights when you go to the Challenge Cup final. So 24th of April, 1897, that was at Headingley.
Yeah, and it's surprising as well that it wasn't the best teams that got to the final because just trying to find the league table quick. So Batley were actually sixth in the Yorkshire League. St Helens were actually ninth in the Lancashire League. So it wasn't, Broughton Rangers, Brighouse Rangers, Oldham, Manningham. They were the big teams of the era, but they got knocked out quite early on, and Batley and St Helens went through to the final.
Batley actually beat Brighouse in third round. So when we lost to Brighouse, we there's a chance we might have played Batley. Batley beat Brighouse, and where Broughton? Broughton didn't. Broughton won the Lancashire League, and I can't even find them. Did they get
Well, they
knocked
drew,
out?
they drew 0-0 with Warrington in the first round. In the second round,
Oh,
they
they
lost
lost in the
3-0 in the
replay.
replay.
Yeah. So the best two teams really were out by round three. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Manningham lost away at Wigan. So yeah, all these better. Obviously, Manningham won the first ever league that we mentioned on the last podcast, and then you're looking at Halifax and Hunslet. Where did they go? So Halifax beat Leeds Parish Church. Then they beat Crompton. Then they lost in the quarterfinals to Warrington. So yeah, so these bigger teams and Batley beat Widnes, St Helens beat Tildesley. Then the semi-finals, Batley beat Warrington and St Helens beat Swinton in front of 20,000 at Broughton. So yeah, entertaining stuff there. So good stuff. That's first ever Challenge Cup. So going back to the league, Dad. So we talk us through the season. Obviously, we've mentioned before Trinity in the first season was a massive amalgamation of every single team possible in the same league. There were 22 teams. Wakefield finished 19th out of 22. So hopefully a change in fortunes for us this year.
Yeah, because we weren't travelling too far, were we? Obviously, the furthest we travelled was Hull, but everything else was around the West Riding area. But it was a very sort of inconsistent season. The first match of the season, we played Hull at home and won 3-0. Sorry, we lost 3-0. And then we played Castleford at home and won 12-3. The next match we went to Halifax and then we lost at Bramley. So it was very inconsistent as it to of the season, and we ended up with 13 wins, 13 defeats, and 4 draws in our 30 games. So it was like win one, lost one. I don't think we didn't win any more than we didn't have any more than two successive wins at once. The seventh position was the highest we got. Having said that, to successive wins, we had 4 successive wins in late November and December. and then followed it with four successive defeats in October and dropped to 13th. So that the highest we got was 7th, the lowest we got was 13th. We had some big wins. The highlights were drawing 3-3 with Manningham, who were top of the league at the time in February. 3 days later, in a midweek game, we played Brighouse Rangers, and they were second place. We beat them 3-0 at home. And Brighouse went on to be the champions. So even back then, the Bellevue ground was being classed as a graveyard for visiting teams. We also beat third place Hunslet 11-0 in January, in which was one of the highlights of the season. So we actually the top three. We actually beat Brighouse, we beat Hunslet, and drew with Manningham, so they were quite good. But then we'd lose to silly teams down the bottom end, as is a historical pattern with Wakefield Trinity. The weather in this era was awful. It really was. You really got some atrocious weather. You got wind, you got rain, you got snow, you got sleet, and you got mud. When we were talking about the season before, nothing got cancelled. You just carried on and played in whatever. So this weather must have been bad because in January and February, three successive weekends, we didn't have a game, so they all got cancelled. And because of when they actually did play, there were just very minimal scores. So between the 12th of December and the 24th of March, we only got into double figures once. We had a 0-0 draw at Castleford. We drew 3-3 with Halifax. We beat Leeds Parish Church 6-0, 3-3 with Manningham, 3-0 with Brighouse, as we mentioned, 4-3 against Bradford, lost 3-4 at Heckman White, and so on. And that was the sort of pattern because it was very forward orientated. The ball never got to the backs much, so it was very. If you were lucky, one of the forwards dropped over the line for a try, or you dropped a goal. And that's how it finished, up and down, up and down. We eventually finished eighth in the Yorkshire Senior competition, finishing as we started with 2 wins, 2 defeats, and a 7-7 draw at Leeds. Brighouse won the league, as we mentioned, 2 points clear of Manningham, with Halifax and Hunslet completing the top four.
Yeah, the important thing there is we finished above Castle and Leeds, which is the great thing for us. Yeah, we finished pretty much bang in the middle, mid-table. We won as many as we lost. We almost had the same points difference. Well, we scored 172 points, Leeds 154. Out of a 16-team competition, we finished eighth. Brighouse won the league. Manningham second, just by 2 points. Then Halifax, Hunslet, Hull, Batley, and Bradford finished out the top half with Castleford, Huddersfield, Liversedge, Leeds Parish Church, Bramley, Holbeck, and Heckham Wyke at the bottom half of the table. It's funny there because again we talk about low scoring games. One of the second highest scoring game all season for us. We got 18 points away at Manningham, who were the reigning champions and finished second this year and still lost. We lost
Yeah.
21-18, which is very much a modern day score on the 17th of October away at Manningham. And the only time we scored more than that was 23 points at home to Liversedge when we beat them 23-3 on the 12th of December. Every other game was 13 points or less. Like we said in the first podcast of this, we went a couple of games where we didn't score a point. 19th of December, we lost 3-0. On Boxing Day, away at Castleford, we drew 0-0. Then 2 days later at home to Halifax, we drew 3-3. Then a couple of days later, on 2nd of January, we lost 6-0 away at Bramley. Then beat Leeds Parish Church 6-0 at home. So within about 5 games, we only got 9 points on the field. But equally, I think we only conceded 12 off the field. So just funny results out there, really. But it's the number of draws as well, Dad. We've How many games did we draw there? We drew out of 30 games, we drew four, which would be absolutely mind blowing these days. You're lucky to get one draw, but looking at these, Castleford drew 6 games, Huddersfield drew seven, Brighouse, who won the league, drew four. The majority of teams drew four or more games. There was only one team in the entire league, Liversedge, who didn't draw a single game. So again, like you say, that the not so much the conditions were different, but the actual obviously you didn't have groundsmen, you didn't look after you probably didn't look after yourself as well as what you do these days. So point scoring and skill wasn't high on the agenda. But yeah, just some bizarre results and a lot of draws, almost like in a football in terms, a lot of draws.
It isn't it? Yeah, it's just the pattern of the game, wasn't it? You look through the pattern of these 1890s, and there were a lot of draws, like you just mentioned. Even in Lancashire, Wigan had seven draws out of their 26 games. Broughton Rangers and Runcorn had 5 draws. So there were just a lot of low scoring games all the way through, and there were a lot of, and I researched the nil-nils we had. We hadn't had a nil-nil since 1968 for a Trinity game. Yet back in the day, we were getting 3-4 nil-nils a season just because it was just more difficult to score.
Yeah, and Paul Ekman at the bottom won 3 games all year out of 30, lost 23, only got 72 points overall. But again, it's funny, even going back all the way to the second ever competition, probably was the same in the first, that the best defensive team won because Brighouse only conceded 68 points all year, and Manningham, who finished second, almost conceded double that. I don't think anyone else got, well, yeah, nobody else conceded less than 100 points. And even though Manningham scored the most with 291, way more than Brighouse at 213, it was Brighouse who won the league, and the same over in Lancashire as well. Broughton only conceded 52 points all year in the Lancashire League. So yeah, Brighouse and Broughton were the best two teams that year. And Wakefield not too bad. They had, like you said, they had a positive win column, so they had 172 points against 154 for points difference, and then they won the same as they lost and drew four. So if we had any Wakefield fans, then I don't know if anybody went week in week out. They'd have probably been marginally happy and mid table there for Trinity.
Yeah, I'll do like my attendance figures, and that's one thing I do research a lot when I do my researching. And they never really announce the crowds. You know, when you're looking through the reports, there's some great reports you can track down on online these days. Looking at the old Wakefield Expresses, the old Wakefield papers back in 1896, they didn't really announce the crowds. They just said it was a healthy crowd. And as I mentioned last time, a lot of it was guesswork. You worked out how much money you took because you took money through your gate. So they announced the receipts of, oh, we've taken £213 this week, but they never actually said how many actually came through the gate. So looking at that game in this season in 1896-97, there were 33 games. I've only got attendance figures for 8 games. The biggest one was 6,500 at Bellevue when Halifax came in December and Hunslet came in January. 7,000 went to Castleford on Boxing Day. So they're the only crowds I could find. I was hopefully trying to get the crowds for the cup against Lee and Brighouse. I thought they might have been big with it being cup, but they just said they were healthy crowds. And I couldn't. The league game at home, the replay after the nil draw was at Bellevue on a Wednesday afternoon, and again, all it said it was a healthy crowd in a spring day, but there were no crowd figures. Incidentally, on that, it did make me smile that when we played Lee at home in the cup replay, it said in the first half we were playing uphill, which made me smile as though there was a hill at Bellevue. So I don't know when that changed. I've never seen anything about a hill at Bellevue where it's been changed or whatever. But yeah, the crowd figures were very healthy to say. You know, you still got 5,000 at Trinity long before you got the stadiums and the terrace in there. So they probably all stood round like you would at East Moor, like just on the side of the field with a rope between you and the pitch.
I think seven, like you say, 7,000 away at Cass on Boxing Day in 1896 is remarkable, really. I think you'd be maybe slightly disappointed with that now, but 7,000 it's more than what you get at some Super League teams now. So especially 130 odd 130 years ago on Boxing Day for a local derby when people were earning much money and there was no access to cars or anything. That's pretty remarkable, really.
It is, isn't it? And that's it's not the Castleford of today either, because that's like that Castleford club we're talking about went bust in the early 1900s, and the present Castleford Tigers club didn't come back until the 1920s. Similar with Bradford, the Bradford team of this era weren't Bradford Northern. It was a Bradford club that went bust, and then Bradford Northern was another club that came together. But I was just you half mentioned it in the semi final in the Challenge Cup. We were happy with 5, 6, 7,000. When St Helens played Swinton at Broughton in the semi-final of the Challenge Cup, 20,000 turned up. So it just shows you, and I haven't researched any other clubs' attendances, but only 13,000 turned up for the final, the Batley St Helens final at Headingley. So the crowds were there. There was also, we'll go into the county championships as well later on, but you got 15,000 for a county championship game as well. So the crowds were there in certain places, but 5,000, 6,000 was our biggest at Bellevue.
Brilliant. Tell us about the players again. Obviously, everybody that listened to the first podcast can have a note, and I've put some stuff online about our first season players, and I'm sure you've got the information as well, Dad. But did a lot of players stay on for the second season?
They did. It was. I love researching the players. Back in this era, I try and find out what sort of people they were and where they lived and what jobs they had as well. But in 18, and with Trinity obviously still didn't have enough money, a lot of money. So the majority of the 1895-96 players continued into the new season, and we had 12 new debutants. new players who made their debuts. But in the early weeks, the press were quite critical of the club because we had no new major signings. So all these 12 new debutants were just juniors who come through the reserves or arrivals from local junior clubs like your East Moors or your Featherstones or Ossets, places like that. Trouble is, of those 12 new players, only two made more than 7 appearances. So they drifted in, played a couple of matches and drifted out. One player, I'm trying to research at the moment, one player who stayed was a fella called William Hale, a giant of a man. So if you've ever seen a team picture I've put on the social media, and I'll put it on again, that'll accompany this. We've got a team picture from 1895, 96, 97. He's a giant of a man. How far outstood the rest of his players. And he played for Trinity for the next 8 seasons. I've been trying to work out where he signed from and where he came from. Haven't found that yet, but he's just the size of him. He appeals to me. He was one of the forwards. The former England Rugby Union international Dickie Lockwood, big fan of Dickie Lockwood. He actually came from Criggleston, but he went on to play for England at Rugby Union and captained England at Rugby Union. We mentioned him last time. It's the equivalent of Trinity signing a big star now. It was his second season at Trinity. He found his rugby league legs, his Northern Union legs, and was a real standout performer throughout the campaign. Of the 33 games we played, he played 31, scored 7 tries, kicked 23 goals, and 23 goals in 1896 was very Neil Fox-esque. It's the equivalent of kicking over 100 now because it was very difficult to kick goals out of the mud 130 years ago. Whenever you read the paper reports, whenever the ball did get out wide and the wingers did score, Dickie Lockwood was always mentioned. You know, he might have got 7 tries, but he got double assists as well when I've researched his season. On the other centre was a fella called Tommy Howell. They're a bit like Corey Hall and Ollie Pratt and Cam Scott now. Tommy Howell was his sidekick, and he was ever present in the other centre. Played all 33 games. He was quite fleet of foot, had a good sidestep on him. But his main skill was a drop goal. When I've researched this fella, he slotted over 5 drop goals. But not just a drop goal in front of the post, he could bang them over from the touchline. He could just, from all sorts of obscure angles near the touchline. And back in the day, this day, a drop goal was worth 4 points. So a lot of our wins came from Tommy Howell drop goals. And when we talk about Whistle playing in the mud and the rain and the wet, he's dropping goals from the touchline and kicking them over the H's, the posts. Some skill that fella had.
And Tommy Howell was the only one to play every game that year as well, wasn't he?
Was he? Were they only ever present?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he stood out. I think he's Heritage number 3. I'm sure he played in the year before, and he was number 3 in the very first game. So he's a fellow that stands out for me. Full back was a fellow called Benjamin Todd. He only missed 1 game, so he played 32 out of the 33. As did a fellow called Josh Breakwell. He was a standoff. The term standoff wasn't used in 1896. He was called halfback. And Josh Breakwell, he's quite a name in the Trinity history because when he retired from the game, he ended up on the committee many years later. So Todd and Breakwell were 2 big star names in the back line. The Tom Johnston of the day was a fella called Horace Price. He was a Welshman, and we signed him from Bradford area. I've gone off the top of my head now. I can't remember. But that's where he came from the season before. He scored 10 tries, and 8 of those came from Dickie Lockwood assists. His main problem was he kept dropping the ball. And when you look at I've read all the reports, and he scored 10 tries, but he could have got another 10 as well. But he had suspect hands and dropped more balls when it was going out to his wing, which didn't please the forwards because they were doing the donkey work in the middle, shoving the ball out. When it did go out wide, suddenly Horace Price and drop it. But he was a Tom Johnston of the day, 130 years ago. But obviously Tom Johnston didn't drop the ball like Horace Price did. Some big men in the forwards. It was the era of big, slow men. You had about 8 props in the pack. Jack Allchurch, George Appleyard, William Crossland, Dick Dawson, Arthur Morehouse, George Thresh and Bill Walton. All were sort of cornerstones of our forwards. They all played 26 games or more out of the 33. We had a utility player called Laurie Whitaker. He played all over. He was in the forwards, he was in the halves, he was on the wing. And then we also had a fellow called Edward Milsom. And I've seen the Milsom name cropping up on Facebook, so his relatives are still knocking around as Wakefield fans. He wore the scrum half shirt, but he wasn't called scrum half in 1896. It was called the second halfback. So you got the first halfback and the second halfback. And then we also had a fella called Tommy Evans, who was a mid-season arrival from Featherstone. So they were our big names and the players that played more than 20 games throughout our season.
Horace Price became the first player to get double figure tries as well. I was just looking in the previous year. Obviously, Bill Walton was top try scorer with 7, but then Horace Price was second with 6, and nobody else got that. So he was the first ever player to get double figure tries for us. And technically, Bill Walton finished the first season being our record try scorer in history because he was the only player to get the top tries. But then Price has obviously jumped him. So Price at this point is now our top try scorer in history with 16 tries as well. And because Bill Walton only got 3 this year. So yeah, interesting from that point. And I was looking, obviously, Harry Kershaw is our heritage number 1, so he's known throughout the history of the club as being the first ever player to represent Trinity. He only played 1 game this year. Did he leave after this year, or did he carry on? Obviously, we'll touch on that in future podcasts. But I'm guessing we don't know the reason why. But did he only play 1 game and that was it?
Well, yeah, I think we also had the reserve grade, reserve team. We call it the A team back in the day. So I've sneaky feeling Benjamin Todd was that good. He played full back all season, whereas Harry Kershaw basically only played 1 game, and that was in January. So he was part and parcel of the reserves because the reserves also. Well, I've mentioned the reserves in our thread, but the reserves also had a league as well, and they finished third. So looking at this team. Um, the full back throughout the reserves was Harry Kershaw. There was a few other names as well. And again, why Horace Price was in the reserves in March, we played a team called Allerton. Now, I don't know which Allerton that is. We never really travelled very far. There is an Allerton in Cumbria, but unless there's an Allerton around here, Horace Price got 6 tries in this A-team reserve game against Allerton, 58-0. So there was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 tries scored. So yes, Harry Kershaw was around, but it looks as though he was in and out and often playing in the A team.
Yeah, and looking at that squad, like you said, that the majority of players. I mean, I think just looking at the number of players, we had 33 players this year. Um, 18, 96, 97. But last year we had almost, was it over 40 players, I think, who made an appearance in the first year. So we definitely cut down, and obviously more players made more appearances. But debutants this year were John Cole, Herbert Dyson, Edward Evans, Tommy Evans, Herbert Glover, John Goodare, William Hale, who you've already mentioned, George Marfette, Herbert Morrill, Alfred Naylor, Arthur Roberts, Red Sheen, Red Sheen being the last, and then everyone else were in their second year. So a lot of Herberts and a lot of Alfreds and Arthurs there of the day. But yeah, all in our legacy there. And a couple of those boys, William Binns, John Cole, Robert Dolan, Joseph Ducker, Harry Kershaw, like we've mentioned, Herbert Morrill, Arthur Roberts, Red Sheen, and Harry Smith. All those names only made 1 appearance. So a lot of big game time for the rest of the squad.
Drifted in and out, weren't they, these guys? I'd love to know what it was how you sort of registered, so a lot of these players came in and drifted away. I think it's like there must have been a lot of these were in the A team. Some had a trial, no good, and then disappeared again. I know the fella called Red Sheehan. I'm trying to work out whether it's Red Sheen or Red Sheehan. He just came from Normanton one day, played for Trinity, and then disappeared off again. So there's a few like that who drifted in and drifted out.
Good
When
stuff.
you add the appearances together, the most appearances combining last season, Tommy Howell's now on 70, and then you've got Bill Walton on 69. You've got Benjamin Todd, the fullback, on 65. So you get a little bit more consistency. Big Joseph Allchurch in the pack, 67. So you got a bit more consistency of players hanging around, and then you just got your reserves drifting in and drifting out throughout the season.
And then tell us about the representative scene at this point. Like you touched already on the county championships.
Yes, there were the previous season. You got Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Cheshire. They were the big 3 county teams in playing rugby league, Northern Union. The previous season, they played everybody home and each other home and away. This season, they only played 1 game, so there was 3 games in the county championships. Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Cheshire all just played each other once. Both Yorkshire and Lancashire had trials, which became quite an important part of the Northern Union representative scene in this era. So I've actually recorded Wakefield players who played in the trials because it was classed as a quite a good representative honour. So you got Yorkshire Probables against Yorkshire Possibles, and that trial match was played at Trinity's Bellevue ground. With only 2,000 there. And Trinity had 3 players selected. Benjamin Todd, the full back, was in the Probables. Bill Walton was in the forwards, and George Thresh was in the Possibles forwards. The Possibles created a slight dilemma for the selectors as they beat the Probables 22-3, with Thresh one of the 5 try scorers. When the team was selected, the first game of the season was Yorkshire Cheshire at Hull at the Boulevard. Um, and strangely, only on the Possibles team won 22-3, but only 4 of those players were selected. And then I looked further, and he said, in fact, none of the selected backline played in the trial game. So this Yorkshire Cheshire game at Hull, the backline None of that backline played in the trial game. So I'm unsure of the benefits of the trial game. Sometimes you actually got a few people that were shoo-ins as though, right, you're that good, you don't need to play in the trial game. I don't know. I need to research that a bit more. But it seems a bit silly having a trial game with with 30 players in this trial game and then none of them being picked for the actual Yorkshire side, which seemed to be a pattern. And Yorkshire beat Cheshire that day, 17-10. 2 weeks later, Yorkshire travelled to Oldham to take on Lancashire for the championship. In between, Lancashire had beaten Cheshire 8-0, so the winners of this Yorkshire-Lancashire game was going to be champions. Bill Walton was actually our only representative. He played against Cheshire and then also played against Lancashire. Lancashire won 7-3 at Oldham. 15,000 turned up. So that was the county championships, the Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cheshire game, and Lancashire won the because they won their both games. So they were the very first, or they were the county champions in 1897.
And then just around the world at this time as well, we touched on some great stuff last time where X-rays were created and the cinematic universe was created with the first feature film, and the Olympics were happening as well. So what was happening between September 1896 and March 1897? So just before the season started, actually in August, it was the shortest war in history took place. So the Anglo-Zanzibar War in August 1896 lasted just over 1 hour after Britain consolidated control of Zanzibar, strengthening its imperial influence in East Africa, which is a conversation for another day. But yeah, interesting there for a 1 hour war was just before the start of the season. Also, just before the start of the season in August 1896, the gold rush hit North America as gold was found in Klondike and Yukon, sparking mass migration to the northwestern Canada and Alaska, which reshaped those regions economically and demographically for years to come. And preparations began for the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, who sat on the throne for over 60 years at this point in early 1897, just as we hit into the new year, which again reflected the height of the British Empire at that point as well. And then just after the season finished, so May 1897, before the start of the new season, the new Timeless book was brought into stores by Bram Stoker. Dad, you know that famous book that's now quite well known by Bram Stoker?
Dracula.
Dracula, yeah, Dracula came out in May 1897, which still has a very lasting effect to this day. If anybody ever goes to Whitby, not too far from here, it's everywhere and anywhere. And the character of Dracula, and there's been countless films and books and adaptations about that character as well. So yeah, that book came out just after the first ever Challenge Cup final in that generation. So I always find that very interesting. When you match up two timelines, you can't believe when Batley lifted that first ever Challenge Cup trophy in mid 1897, that Dracula the book came out at the same time as well. Anything else to touch on before we round off, Dad?
No, just socially, life in 1896 was very similar to as we mentioned last month. It was Yorkshire was still a very much a powerhouse of industrial and mining activity. Coal mining was big in Wakefield, Bradford, Huddersfield, Halifax, and Leeds. Leeds and the textiles were big in Leeds. Sheffield had steel. Leeds was also big for clothing and footwear. York and Doncaster had the railway transport industry. Wakefield was now a sort of quite a busy cultural city, but bigger active music scene, jazz. Was it jazz in that day? Maybe not. But the theatre was open, so the theatre was busy. Lots of pubs. The Wakefield Golf Club was also opened in 1896. If that's what I'm thinking of, that's the one down Lupsit. So if that's been open for 130 years, well done. Same as we mentioned, people travel around on foot. They actually went to Bellevue on foot, and the teams actually came on horse-drawn buses. The only other thing I found is back in 1896, we had three local papers that were brought out every week, just once a week. The Wakefield and West Riding Herald, the Wakefield Free Press, and the Wakefield Express. And the Wakefield Express is still going today, and that was invented in 1862. And they're ideal. They're all online in that era. So that helps me with my research. And when I'm looking at all this Wakefield history from years gone by, a lot of these papers had Wakefield reports in at the time.
Brilliant, good stuff. On to the next season. We'll be back. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching episode 268 of the Wakefield Trinity Heritage Podcast. You can find us all on most social media and podcasting platforms worldwide. And if you are watching on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, a like, a watch, and a subscribe to. Very close to that 450 subscribers. Massive thank you to my co-host, Lee Robinson, and we'll be back this coming weekend with the Trinity back chat after an Easter Sunday battle against Castleford Tigers. I have been Jamie Robinson, and we will catch you all down the road.